Welcome to the American Family Association's weekly cable program. The AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is Voice of the Faithful and the issue of child abuse and its cause. And our host is Patty Knapp.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, our guest is Dan Bartley, one of the original founders and current co-chair of the Long Island Voice of the Faithful organization. Dan is married with 3 children and is a CPA with a master's degree in theology from the Seminary of the Immaculate Conception. Also on with us tonight is Frank Russo, also a member of Voice of the Faithful, but he often finds himself in disagreement with certain speakers from the organization who he views as classic dissidents, I guess we would say, in the Catholic Church. Frank's been married for 42 years. He has 7 children and 21 grandchildren. He belongs to St. Peter's Parish in Port Washington, where he has taught pre-Cana to over 1,000 engaged couples. He also heads his parish Respect Life Committee. Welcome, Dan and Frank. And my co-host tonight is Mike Mulhall.
Thank you, Patty. Our first question tonight, directed towards you, Dan, is give us your view where the child abuse problem in the church currently stands, and what is the major problem area that remains to be addressed?
Well, there's still significant problems in our church with regard to this issue. After all, the bishops who knowingly transferred pedophile priests from one diocese to another, from one parish to another, are still in power. And we have a situation, let's look at the facts. Let's look at the recent audit from the UCCB, and here are the findings that were released in March, just last month. 993 new victims came forward in 2005 with credible allegations involving 753 priests. 66 dioceses in the United States had 15 or more accused priests. The Archdiocese of Chicago passed the audit being in compliance with the Dallas Charter with flying colors, yet we found out last month that Cardinal George was aware that there was a priest who was a known sexual abuser, wasn't ministering. He did not remove him right away. So really, what has changed? Not a whole lot has changed, and it's still a serious problem.
Well, okay, my view on this is there's 2 parts of the problem. The cover-up, which I agree with Voice of the Faithful on in large measure, and the cause of why so many, or the reason why so many priests were sexual abusers. With regard to the cover-up, I differ with Voice of the Faithful. In other words, I'm more optimistic there. I think the church has taken the proper steps necessary now to address the cover-up problem. I don't think you're going to see instances of cover-up occurring anything like the degree to which you saw it happen over the past number of years. In the past, there was some 200 cases of child abuse every year for 50 years, and most of it was covered up. I think you're going to see errors occur, but I mean, they are now alert. They've learned that there's tremendous harm to the victims of child abuse. I don't know that it was fully recognized what the extent and nature of this harm done to the victims of child abuse was. I think they now fully recognize that. And in addition, I think they had an understandable attitude towards the priests, as if they were their brothers or their sons, and they were trying to prevent unnecessarily hurting them. But it was imprudent because it caused a lot of grief for the whole church and for the victims. I think now that's over, except for one problem I see is that the states, New York State in particular, has not made it a requirement for them to report child abuse to the authorities. It should be part of the state law. Today, the state law only requires parental abuse to be reported by professionals known as mandated reporters. All child abuse should be reported by all mandated reporters, not just parental abuse, all child abuse. And I'm trying to get the legislature to act on that. They're unwilling to do that, and Voice of the Faithful is going halfway. They're willing to settle for legislation that deals with that problem halfway. I want to go the full way. All child abuse should be reported. Now, the second part of the problem, that's the area where I have the big difference with Voice of the Faithful. It's why so many priests were in fact abusers. And the John Jay College study, I think, provides enormous evidence that over 80% of the abuse was committed against pubescent and post-pubescent young boys. It was abuse of a homosexual nature. It was not pedophile abuse. We want to deal with that, and we have to understand why did so many the priests behave this way. Well, there's a problem with homosexuality, and now the Vatican hopefully is starting to address that. But there is a distinct relationship between child abuse and homosexuality. The John J. Coward study demonstrated that, I thought, in clear-cut terms. If you look at the ages of the victims, the sex of the victims, it's overwhelmingly 80% plus of a homosexual nature dealing with post-pubescent young boys.
2 points I'd like to respond to. Number one, I disagree that the issue of the bishop's response to the situation is complete. It's clearly not. Last month, as I said about Cardinal George, now Cardinal George is a very high figure in the Catholic Church. He's the vice president of the United States Conference of Bishops. He was one of the architects of the charter. And for him to violate the charter that he helped design as recently as last month, I think raises bells and whistles once again. Regarding legislation, Frank, I think we've gone more than halfway. As of this Wednesday, we had a team in Albany testifying that we believe legislation that extends the statute of limitation with regard to sexual abuse opens a window to go back for people who were not covered under the statute of limitations, and also for mandatory reporting. And we were up in Albany this Wednesday in mass lobbying for these issues.
I've got to respond to that also. The statute of limitations, I think it was too brief. I think it was like 5 years, if I understood it. I don't think it should go, to enormous lengths either, 30 years or 40 years, because that raises questions about the credibility and memory and so forth. So I don't think it should be limitless, but I think it should be extended. But on who should be, not who should be reporting it, we want to add clergy to the list of mandated reporters, but on the issue of what child abuse should be reported, Voice of the Faithful and the liberal Democrats and the liberal Republicans are a major obstacle. They don't want to have to report felony statutory rape. I don't want to say Voice of the Faithful takes that position, but they're supporting the legislation by liberals in the Assembly and the Senate. They only want to report abuse committed by people in positions of trust. They're not including abuse by neighbors, which is very extensive, abuse by strangers, and statutory rape, felony statutory rape. When you have a 24-year-old guy having sex with a 13 or 12-year-old girl, that's felony rape. That should be included. The legislation that Voice of the Faithful is endorsing, and I'm not willing to endorse, excludes that half of the abuse cases. On the matter of Cardinal George, just to point out, Cardinal George, I think, is one of the finest cardinals we have. I don't think it was his personal error, even though he did extend apologies. I think he went above and beyond what was appropriate to have to apologize for. It was staff errors. The police did not clearly identify that case. And again, my basic point is it's not 100% cleared up. But we're going to see, because of the attention focused, a tremendous reduction in cover-up. You're not going to see it. What Cardinal George did was not the intentional cover-up. There was ambiguity there. The police didn't even share the information that they found out about that priest. Some of the administrative people under Cardinal George, I think, should have acted differently, and I agree with Voice of the Faithful on that. It was not a personal error of Cardinal George's in my estimation. The focus should now be on what do we do to reduce the number of priests who are abusers.
My second question, and I'll direct it towards you, Frank, is the Voice of the Faithful mission calls for greater participation by the laity in the decision-making process by the Catholic Church. In what aspects do you see increased participation by the laity as something beneficial?
Well, I agree with Voice of the Faithful that there should be increased participation in the area of finance. I think that's just self-evident to me, that we should have more lay people advising parishes and dioceses. And to my knowledge, there is a lot of lay advice available, and they have these financial councils. So I agree with that. Now, there's another area in terms of public policy areas. The laity gets involved there, and I think the laity should get involved even more with official diocesan, like we have something called, I think it's the Public Policy Network, I believe it is. And to be honest, I have a lot of problems with them. There's certain issues that get very complicated. For instance, the church, clear cut, we have an obligation to help the poor. How much do you go to help the poor? How extensive is this obligation? Right, and I mean, and then there's the issue of immigration, which Bishop Murphy, I think, dealt with in a very properly written, I thought it was a very fine article, balancing both sides. A nation has a right to control its borders, and on the other hand, we should be a charitable nation and be inviting and welcome to people coming from poor countries who are going hopefully grow and develop and assist the people in this country. So it's a delicate balance. But a lot of the people on these public policy networks, I think, have I don't want to say a far left slant, but they don't have a practical, what's called prudential judgment. The church recognizes something called prudential judgment. I think they're many times lacking in prudential judgment. But I agree that there is a need for lay involvement.
I'm pleased that you agree with Voice of Faithful's position on this, and I think greater involvement by the laity in decision making it would be very beneficial for our church on many levels, including the issue of sexual abuse. Had we believed firmly that had a parent been involved while the abuse was taking place, they would have stopped immediately. There would have been no question that you take a chance that one of our children would be abused. So on that level, it's certainly important. Additionally, as an example of what we see as greater representation or greater participation by the laity is what we're calling for with the formation of a representative finance council. Recent financial analysis performed by a senior financial person revealed that our diocese holds more than $185 million in excess cash reserves. So with regard to the poor, for instance, yeah, we think that money such as this should be used in that regard. But it's not up to us. Our position is it's not up to Voice of the Faithful to make these decisions. It's up to the community. And we are saying that a council should be formed that sits alongside the existing appointed council to talk about and give advice with regard to spending priorities. What do we do with this money now that we've accumulated it? That the appointed council has done a fabulous job, and we acknowledge that, of safeguarding assets. And we're saying the people that give the money in the first place should say, hey, we have this money, here's what we should do with it. We have the poor. I'm sorry, we do have a condition of poor in our diocese. We also have a situation where sisters and priests' retirement funds are underfunded. We have poor parishes throughout the diocese that are strapped with debt. Schools closing, we got the Catholic educational system. There's so much good that can be done, and we fail to see from a gospel perspective the basis for holding such vast amounts of wealth.
And just very briefly, I mean, I draw a distinction between the revenue, if you use money, cash revenue versus the reserves. In other words, you get income, you want to spend that income doing good things. I draw a distinction between programs that the government largely deals with, dealing with the poor and so forth. All the churches and synagogues combined don't add that much to what the government does. But those areas, I do agree, like Catholic education, where the government cannot help, I do agree with some parts of what Voice of the Faithful say.
This idea is reasonable for
Yeah.
a second committee to look at.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into that more, I think, with more questions later.
We're about at the midway point of our program. On behalf of the we're going to take a quick public service announcement.
Oh, this is
When's Daddy coming home?
That's great.
Daddy, Daddy!
Tell him to turn on the voice a little. Tell him to turn on the voice if he can.
You got me.
So how was work?
Brutal. One meeting after another. I got a ton to do tonight.
At the end of the day, when the weight of the world is upon you,
Daddy doesn't want to play. Hey!
isn't it amazing
All right.
how the weight of their love can lift you up again?
Hey, you guys coming to dinner? Hey, guys.
For a free brochure about rediscovering the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY and focus on the family.
Welcome back to our program. We're interviewing Dan Bartley tonight of Voice of the Faithful, Frank Russo, who's also a member, but they have some slight disagreements. I just wanted to mention there are so many studies out recently about the possible causes of homosexuality that maybe have fostered or brought about this new directive of the Vatican regarding the ordination of homosexual priests because they found a relationship between homosexuality and the child abuse problem, and homosexuality has found to be so compulsive, and that's why there's often dozens of victims per abuser. And there's the whole question of the relationship with a child and his father when he's growing up. So we can't assume that the homosexual issue is going to go away by any means with single-parent families and the broken family issue. But I wanted to ask you, Dan, do you agree with the Vatican's new directive on not permitting the ordination of homosexual priests, or if they're found in the seminary, to say that it's time for them to leave?
We believe in further research on this matter, which is exactly what the Catholic Church is doing. They recently sponsored and funded, put up the seed money for a research on this issue with the John Jay College in conjunction with Fordham University, and that's something that's very important. And perhaps there is a correlation, and if so, we would have to change our position to agree with this directive, but at the current time, we don't. We don't believe that a priest's sexual orientation is the issue. They're supposed to be celibate, after all. What we do see this as an issue of scapegoating. It points away and brings us away from the focus back to the bishops and the system that exists today, which has not changed, that allowed for cover-up and facilitated the whole abuse of children. To us, that's the issue. But we do recognize and do not deny that there may be a relationship between homosexuality and the sexual abuse crisis, but we have to look and say, we agree with the position that let's research it. Let's not do something, let's not go on a witch hunt until we know.
Well, that sounds reasonable, but wouldn't you agree that the abuse comes before any potential cover-up or release of information? I mean, first we have to try to stop the abuse before we're worried about whether there's been a cover-up.
Of course, but we need to know, is there this direct relationship? And obviously we don't know, or the Church wouldn't be funding a study to determine that.
Okay, Frank, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my mind, it's very, very clear from the research that the John Jay College has already provided on the sex abuse crisis. The Pastoral and Homiletic Review had a work done by 2 professors analyzing all the numbers summarized from the John Jay College. Over 80% of this abuse was of a homosexual nature. That is, it involved post-pubescent young boys as victims. And that is, many other studies show that homosexuals do have a proclivity, a significant number of homosexuals have a proclivity and an attraction to young men. It's not that there is an age relevance. They like young boys, not prepubescent boys, which is pedophilia. There's a clear, in summary, there's a very clear indication already, a very clear, not only in this study, not only in the John Jay College study, but in many, many other studies, of a connection between homosexuality and child abuse being abusing anyone under the age of 17. Pedophilia, it's less clear if they're prepubescent victims, but the Church, the Vatican, I think, has acted properly if they have been involved with homosexual activity, if they don't accept the Church's official teaching that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered, which Voice of the Faithful apparently does not accept. Many of the members there have publicly indicated they disagree with the Church's teaching that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered. At the same time, we do have, where the Church also teaches us, we must love and respect the homosexual, just as we love and respect the drug addict, the alcoholic, the kleptomaniac. You have to love and respect everyone, but if they have a disorder, we have to recognize that and be, you don't may not want to have an alcoholic as an airplane pilot or the things of that sort.
So it sounds like this study that Dan is talking about is maybe a little bit redundant. Frank, do you believe that the moral authority of bishops has been compromised in any way because of the sex abuse scandal? I mean, recently we had Representative King from Long Island challenging the bishop's position on immigration, which is a huge issue today.
Yeah, I have to say, no question in my mind. I think what Dan has said and what Voice of the Faithful said, the bishop's credibility, the confidence that people are going to have in bishops has been shaken. I think it's clear and it's self-evident. They made a tremendous number of mistakes, by the way, there are 200 victims of child abuse in the Catholic Church each year for the past 50 years, some 11,000 victims over 50 years. A recent study by the U.S. Department of Education, covered up by the New York Times, covered up by Newsday, done by Professor Cheryl Shakespeare of Hofstra University, very respected professor of education, found out there are not 200 victims of child abuse. This was on sexual misconduct by educators. Not 200 victims per year, 29,000 victims per year of sexual abuse by educators, people in the...
It's just such glaring hypocrisy
it's
that they won't report
and they won't
that.
even report it. So this is a huge problem that I think has been grossly underestimated and covered up by bishops, by school superintendents, by everybody.
In general.
People did not realize how extensive a problem it is. I think the bishops, they have no excuse now, and I think you're going to see this cover-up, where I share Voice of the Faithful is concerned. I think it's going to be reduced by not 100%, because there's always going to be errors in administrating it, but I think you're going to see a 99% reduction in cover-ups. You're going to see these people exposed and dealt with as they should be.
Let me just say, I think the thinking for many decades was that with abusers, they weren't aware, people weren't aware of the recidivism rate. I think people thought, oh, you went for some counseling.
Absolutely right.
And you were fine after that. And I think that was a mistake. And so, just giving them the benefit of the doubt, I think that's what they were thinking at the time. They sent these priests off for some counseling, and they really hoped and prayed that was the end of it. Now we know that they were wrong. But Dan, maybe this is an area where you have some agreement that,
I'm sure
yes,
we
the
do.
bishop's voice has been compromised.
I think there's no question the voice of the credibility of the bishops has been compromised. And let's just look at the reality of the situation. The bishops that were involved in the cover-up are still in office. That's a fact that we can't dispute. Now, we can hope that the situation has changed and given changed conditions that they would make the right decisions, but we don't know that. And that does not eliminate the credibility gap. And the problem here, the sad problem is, we need a strong moral voice in this country. And that strong moral voice, it would be great if we had our bishops to fill that role. We have economic concerns, we have issues regarding immigration, we have life and death issues that we face in this country every day. It would be wonderful, and we would fully support. We long for the day where we have a group of credible bishops that are not tainted by this scandal, who could speak credibly and with authority on these issues. We long for that day.
That's a good way to put it.
There's a concern, Dan, though, that the Voice of the Faithful disagrees with many of the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church, and that they tend to have a more liberal view on many matters. And I guess the best example, while all of them don't agree, there is a dissident group within Voice of the Faithful that seems to support homosexuality. And the Church has always believed that homosexuality is gravely sinful, but at the same time we must treat homosexuals with charity and respect. How do you feel about that?
Our official position on church teaching is, and it's in our documents, we believe what the church believes. Are there members in our organization who challenge and disagree with certain church teachings with regard to homosexuality, for instance, in calling homosexuals assorted? Likely. Are there people in the Catholic Church in general who disagree and have problems with that teaching? Yes. I think the issue here is that what Frank has observed is at our meetings, when he raises this issue, I believe when the people at our organization are not thrilled with when Frank raises this issue, it's not because necessarily they disagree with the teaching, but it just comes across as gay bashing and a witch hunt and scapegoating. And that's not right, and that's not what we need to be focusing on. Let the research take its course, let this issue evolve, and let's get good information and do what we need to do. But let's stop the witch hunts and the gay bashing. It's just not appropriate.
But before,
I've got to
I know, but before we go to Frank, the Church has used the words, quote, intrinsically disordered, and I think that is from the point of view that someone like Frank approaches this, which is Frank and many other people in the Church would look at this and say, well, there is some form of disorder here, and I think Frank...
Well, when he talks about gay, my best friend of 20 years was closet homosexual. He was one of the first 5,000 to die of AIDS. It's immoral to gay bash. I'm trying to address the cause of the problem. There's the cover-up, and then there's why are so many priests abusers. And I'm trying to focus on that at Voice of the Faithful meetings, and so many times they are so rude. Now, when Dan says they might view this as gay bashing, don't you think there are many Catholics that view Voice of the Faithful as bishop bashing and witch hunting against the bishops?
That's a good
yes,
point.
The bishops made terrible mistakes. They were not immoral decisions. They were imprudent decisions. They were stupid and foolish decisions.
Ignorant
but you don't call
decisions.
for bishops to resign. Voice of the Faithful is increasingly getting the image, and I don't think they should want this and relish this, of being bishop bashers. They're against bishops if they view the bishop, in my mind, too many of the Voice of the Faithful people view certain bishops as more traditional in their moral thinking. They're upset with those bishops, so they use this as a way to bishop bash and witch hunt against the bishops. So what Dan's saying, some of the Voice of the Faithful people viewed as, I simply tried in a respectful, intelligent way at these meetings, let's discuss the cause of the problem. We have an enormous amount of data already. The John Jay College study is completed. It gives us the data.
And that's not the only research.
No, there's a dozen other studies that show a tremendously high connection and correlation. Not all homosexuals are abusers, by the way, but they're much more likely to abuse children than heterosexuals. The data is out there, and I'm trying to discuss this with Voice of the Faithful in an intelligent way. They get rude, they upset me, and they won't let the meeting continue. They try to, they try to stop and stifle discussion. They're not open-minded in Voice of the Faithful.
To be fair to Dan and Voice of the Faithful, though, we can cite all the data in the world, but if the church's commitment is truly to the human condition, and then we read about people who've committed suicide as the result of being abused, it's hard, whether it's only 1 or 100 or 1,000, to not hold these bishops accountable when they were presented with,
they were responsible,
valid information by some valid
Billions
sources
of dollars have been paid
that should
because
have
of this.
required
Yeah.
follow-up. And if they didn't have the answers, they could have gone to people like Dan and even yourself or any of us
Yeah.
that participate
They
in the
made up.
Catholic
They
Church.
made mistakes, terrible
and,
mistakes.
Dan, I'll give you a chance to respond, because
Well,
I think you're both on the same page with some slight disagreements.
We are,
I
and
don't
we
think
have
it's
been, and
right.
you've raised a number of issues, but I want to look at this from a slightly different perspective, and that's, let's go to Scripture and let's look at Jesus and what Jesus did. He did not spend a lot of time, if any time, talking about sexual issues, including homosexuality. And we, as a
Nor child
church,
abuse.
continue to focus on this issue. A celibate, male-dominated church continues to spend an awful lot of time talking about sexuality. I would say let's follow the example of Jesus, our founder, and leave the mystery of human sexuality to God. And let's love one another and recognize each other in the image and likeness of God, as we've been
Jesus
asked
never
to do.
talked about child abuse. He never talked about finance or advice to be provided to rabbinical groups. He never talked about these things, but Voice of the Faithful is addressing them, and they're relevant. Simply because Jesus didn't mention them doesn't mean they're irrelevant. Voice of the Faithful was initiated because of the child abuse problem. There are two parts of it, like I've said many times before: cover-up and the cause. The cover-up, we're all in agreement on it. That's wrong. It has to stop, and I think it's 99% stopped. The problem that has to be addressed now is the cause. Why so many priests were abusers? It's clearly the homosexuality, in my mind, is clear-cut. Let me ask Dan point blank: does Voice of the Faithful agree with the Church's teaching that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered?
We believe what the church believes.
Answer that question, though. Do you agree that
It's a blanket statement that covers all church teaching.
Does the Church teach that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so Voice of the Faithful accepts that.
There's various degrees. Voice of the Faithful does not give opinions on any particular church teaching. That's why we have a blanket statement. Let me answer, Frank. On we believe what the church believes. But within church teaching, there are various degrees of authority, and we're not bound as Catholic to blindly accept all teaching as equal.
But
the teaching that Jesus is God is not equal to the church's teaching on capital punishment. So Catholics can disagree.
Frank,
Voice of Faithful does not, but our membership is, and all Catholics are entitled to disagree.
We're going to have to wrap it up in our remaining 30
Okay.
seconds. Frank, do you want to
It's
respond?
crystal clear. Church's teaching. It's in the Catechism. It's been the teaching forever. It's in the Old Testament, Leviticus. It's in the New Testament. Homosexuality is a disorder. It's an evil. It's a grave sin, and it's a disorder that now has caused child abuse problems for the Catholic Church.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Dan Bartley, Voice of the Faithful, Frank Russo, for joining us. Thank you to our viewers this evening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us.